So the topic of this panel is funding for 911 in Colorado. What the current state is, in your opinion, and what the future of it might look like. So we have with us today John Frey on the phone, who is an attorney representing Larimer Emergency Telephone Authority. We have Joe Benkert representing Boulder Regional Emergency Telephone Service Authority. Lynn Notarianni from the Public Utilities Commission. We have Bob Cole representing El Paso Tele 911. Is that correct? Okay, so multiple. And Susan Travis from the Public Utilities Commission, and Jeff Irvin, who I've asked to sit in as the chair of the 911 Task Force. And I should remember to talk into the microphone so that people can hear me. You just missed all of those introductions. Hopefully you heard a little bit of it. The first question, and again, I have starter questions, but please jump in with your questions as we move forward. How do you view the current state of 911 funding in Colorado? Is the 911 funding sufficient for all areas of the state? And with the microphone behind you, we'll just pass it down the line.
I think that's a very difficult question to answer because of us being in a transition period. Brett's view is that the 911 surcharge is a surcharge, and so the fund should be used relative to routing, processing, recording telephone calls. Not everyone takes that limited a view of use of the surcharges. But even that could be changing. I've heard Jeff talk about interest in Jefferson County of being able to transfer calls from a dispatcher to a responding first responder, keeping it through the phone system so you still get the recording. I understand that up in Georgetown, I forget the name of that county, Clear Creek County, that they've been looking at a CAD system that might allow them to do similar things. And then we are talking about routing and handling phone calls. You are then actually getting it into the radio system, even if you weren't already spending money on radios, and so that's additional expense. When it comes to talking about next gen, for some rural authorities, there's a thought they may see their expenses come down because they'd be able to purchase hosted CAD and telephone systems where they pay a per month license fee, wouldn't have to come up with capital costs to buy systems, wouldn't have to have IT support people for the systems because they'd have dumb terminals in the PSAP, and all the host computers would be in a central location, and the vendor would, take care of that for a monthly license fee. The question there is how much is it going to cost for the transmission facilities to connect the PSAPs to the host location. And then on top of that, a lot of the thought has been and discussion is that if we have next gen, we're going to be sizing it to send video and photos to all the PSAPs. There are people in the public safety community who don't think that there's going to be a lot of need and use for photos and videos. And if you're only going to be sending them or finding them useful in a small percentage of cases, in those cases you might just say to the person, here's an internet address, here's a text message address at the PSAP, just send it over the public internet to us with a picture of the video. Then if you're sizing your next generation 911 network to handle phone calls, text messages, and interconnecting the PSAP so that you'd be able to send CAD records when you transfer a call, you're talking about a much less capacity you're paying for. All those things are going to affect what kind of costs we need to be meeting with the surcharge. And so I think it's really hard at this point to predict because a lot of these things are yet to be fleshed out as we see, how other states are deploying next-gen 911 actually use it, and as we decide what do we want to have.
So certainly the the commission isn't the one in the best position to know the costs on whether there's increased costs for each of the individual 911 authorities. The commission essentially has two roles in my mind when it related to and when it comes to funding. Statutorily, I think Commissioner Patton mentioned earlier that the commission does have the regulatory oversight of the basic emergency service provider, or if there are multiple basic emergency service providers. So certainly in that role, we would need to look to and assure that the costs and therefore the prices that are charged out to the various authorities are as cost effective and as efficient as possible. And Joe mentioned a bit of it, but I would expect that if for no other reason, for a period of time, because we are going to have to maintain an existing network while we're transitioning to a new network in the next gen 911 space, there are going to be some increased costs resulting from that and some pressure on there. And we're going to need to look to, if it's not the surcharge, other ways that we might be able to get some of that network funded on an ongoing basis. The second role we have is with approval of surcharges over 70 cents. Then an authority comes to the commission and files an application, and we basically vet the costs to make sure that they're appropriate within the confines of the statute and needed by the authority to do the business they're doing. And I'm going to let Susan Travis, because she works with these applications routinely, kind of give you an indication of, are we seeing an increased number of applications coming in or not, and kind of what the range of price of surcharges that we're starting to see being requested. I'll let her speak to that.
Okay, Bob Cole, thank you for inviting me, Daryl, and letting me speak to this issue. First, I'd like to say that I think it's fitting that you have three attorneys on this panel. A lot of the import of this question and the others really depend on a bunch of facts that we have no idea about. Presently we're able to forecast in the future, and as attorneys, we make up facts all the time and deal with them. So, with that as a background, what my guess of the facts are, no better than any of you. But state of 911 funding in Colorado, I see it currently and in the future similar to Lynn and Joe as being uncertain, but also with a continuing increasing demand on the funds that are provided. Traditionally, the 911 funds, the surcharge funds, were available for and used for really the basic emergency service provider costs, getting the 911 calls into the center. And that initially was really pretty much it. And over time, the statutes have been broadened, and the practice has been broadened within the confines of those statutes. And where the money has been available, those uses have greatly expanded. So the statute currently includes, besides paying for basic emergency service provider service, that's the bill you pay to CenturyLink, equipment directly related to receipt and routing of emergency calls, costs for wireless ANI and ALI, emergency notification service, so that's been an expansion. I'll come back to the next one, which I think is really throwing the barn door open. But another one, costs related to continued operation of the emergency telephone service and emergency notification service, personnel expenses in the PSAP, including call takers, dispatchers, and database managers, GIS data and other type of database managers. If there's money left over from all the above, then you can use funds for emergency medical services provided by telephone, and also to redirect non-emergency calls. Now, back in that first group, I said there was a opportunity that really threw the barn door open, I think. And I'm going to quote the statute. You can spend money on costs associated with total implementation of both services meaning emergency telephone and emergency notification service. So costs associated with total implementation of both services by emergency service providers. I believe that's the fire, police, ambulance people on the ground, including costs of programming, radios, and emergency training programs. To me, that is a very, very broad use of the funds. And so what we have seen with that, with other budget constraints on the governments that are trying to provide this, is looking at the 911 funds to fund these kinds of services that traditionally have been funded out of the general funds of the county, municipal, and special district governments. So that's a big change. And then you add on top of that the uncertainties of next gen, the cost increases there. I think that what we're going to see over time is just more and more broadening of the use of funds where they're available, requests by the general government providers, whether it's the police department, the sheriff's office, etc., to direct some of those monies back toward the ground, the other end of the radio communication, not just in the PSAP. But I think that's where a lot of the pressure is going to go on the state of 911 funding, and whether there's going to be sufficient funds is in part based on the surcharge. And so I see a lot of surcharge increases not going as they have in the past just for the BESP service, but to fund some of these additional items.
Well, I think funding for 911 comes from a mix of revenue sources. One is the 911 surcharge, as well as local taxes and local property taxes. It is up to the local authorities to decide how much money goes to fund 911 outside of the surcharge. I do think with the implementation of Next Gen 911, it will put pressure on 911 funding and where that goes. I do believe that Colorado has kept pace with the advances in the telecommunications area, in that there is a flat fee placed on wireline, wireless, and interconnected voice services. For the prepaid services, it's a percentage of the price at the point of sale. So I do think we have kept pace with assessing the telecommunications, but with the implementation of Next Gen, I do believe that we're going to have to make sure that the funding is equitable and that all forms of telecommunications who has the capability of directing a 911 call should be paying into the fund. And this might include the vehicular telematics, home alarm systems, and stuff like that.
This is Jeff Irvin, Jefferson County Emergency Communication Authority. We represent both Jefferson and Broomfield counties, and I'm also the PUC Task Force, 911 Task Force Chair for the state. My concern, well, first let me speak locally with our authority. We've taken a pretty broad interpretation of statute with application of surcharge funds. We kind of have always interpreted a continuum from the 911 caller to the arrival of the first responder, and anything that's pretty much in the communications path are things that we've identified as things that could be considered for funding. Now, our main concern is properly staffing and equipping the PSAP. So that's kind of our schedule of priorities of things that we fund. That's where we look first, is does the PSAP have what it needs? Do we have the latest equipment, and are we meeting the needs of the folks that work there, the dispatchers and what have you, as far as training standards and equipment? Then we look at technology expansion is continuously occurring. We're moving towards IP. In addition to answering those calls or getting them routed and communicating with first responders, we have to record all that information, not only in a logging system for radio and phone, but also in a CAD system, CAD systems that can interoperate and intercommunicate. So those are things that we've identified. But we've always taken the stance of trying to encourage interoperability of these systems where we can have synergies and use single platform or hosted systems or I'm talking about cloud hosting. We've looked at developing our own geodiverse platforms, and now we're looking towards cloud for future planning, trying to make sure that as we fund these systems, that we're getting the best bang for our buck. We're also looking at some level of consolidation, trying to consolidate some of these PSAPs to get more efficiency and better use of technology. When I look out, we're very fortunate here in the metro area. We have a large subscriber base, so we have a lot of revenue coming into our authority, and we have the luxury of being able to use that. But as I look out across the state and I see the rurals and the others out there that aren't so similarly situated, my concern is for them and for us is how do we capture funds from this transient populace, people that live in the metro area and recreate elsewhere, people that traverse our state, that can be very, very heavy users of 911 and the associated systems and the first responders. And the mechanism we have now, as in funding other things in the state through property tax or other things, just doesn't keep up with that flow. And I don't know how we do that, but I think we ought to be thinking about and moving towards some model that somehow measures that level of traffic and bases the revenue that comes in based upon that level of whether it's wireless traffic going through an area or something. The amount of revenue is gauged to that rather than the way it is now, where we just happen to be lucky enough to have a bunch of subscribers living in our neighborhood. We get a lot of money. If we're living in some sparsely populated place, we get very little or none. And yeah, it seems like they're charging an awful lot, but look at what they're having to fund out there with very few people to fund it. So it's very disparate. It's not a good system, and I think hopefully everyone, I've seen a lot of head nods out there, would agree that something needs to change in the future.
John, are you still there?
I'm still here. I had some difficulty hearing most of what Jeff was saying, but let me add just my thoughts, because I think they're the same as everyone else's. I think, first of all, Bob Cole is right. If I understood his remarks, is the last people that you should have making policy are the attorneys for the authority boards. Notoriously bad policymakers. But that being said, that never keeps us from giving our opinions. I think the way we've looked at it in Larimer is that really what we have and should have is a concern about the level of service statewide, which impacts everybody in the state, not just in those rural areas, because with the way people move around and so forth, it's really a statewide need, but we don't have a statewide methodology for funding. I think that's what it's always come down to. When we have these philosophical discussions, it always comes down to that, about how you shift that. I think Joe's point is a good one, that maybe part of that is ameliorated if what we have in NG 911 is less need for a lot of hardware that's going to make it cheaper in those less populated areas to provide that service. The expanse of the language, really, since I've been doing this, and I think I started representing LEDA in 1993, Kimberly can probably correct me, but I think it was 93, and we had gone live with E911 in 1990, or I'm not sure of those dates, but it's a long time ago under any circumstances. We really struggled with that initial language because it was very restrictive, and then it got very expansive, and different authority boards have addressed it different ways. I think our board has been very conservative on what we've done with the surcharge, and we started at 50 cents, reduced it to 45 cents, and have never changed it. And that, I think, is somewhat because of our conservative approach, but it's also sort of a poster child for what happens if you're in a county where the population is growing, it's becoming, the income becomes higher, so the number of cell phones becomes higher, it just generates more revenue. We've been very, very fortunate, and there's lots of areas of the state that haven't been. I think it's a revenue equality thing, and whether or not you recognize the statewide need for a increased level of service for everybody, regardless of what the population base in individual areas are doing to collect revenue. So I don't know if that answers it, is a systemic problem with the way we collect revenues and providing what we perceive to be as a need for equal statewide coverage. I don't know if that adds to the discussion or not, but I do think it summarizes when we've had these philosophical discussions where we've come down on that.
Thank you, John. Not to defend my choice of staffing the panel, the reason why there are attorneys on the panel today is because there was a very spirited discussion, I think it was between you, Joe, and Dennis Tharp, about funding at a recent task force meeting, and I thought that would be a great discussion to have at 911 Goes to Denver. So that's, since it was two attorneys in there, I guess I figured if I added a couple more, it'd make it be even better.
Let me say to that, Dale, you don't need to apologize to attorneys for giving them an opportunity to talk.
Well, that's good to know. My next item kind of dovetails off of this, and Jeff, I think you kind of hit on it the most. The surcharge rates in Colorado range from the lowest being 43 cents and the highest being $1.75. And if you map those out, where those are, you see a definite pattern emerge where the mountain counties are definitely much higher, have much higher surcharge rates than the rest of the state. Do you see this as a disparity? Do you see this disparity as concerning, or is this just one of the different costs associated with where people choose to live? And that question, I mentioned you, Jeff, but this question's for all of you.
I think it's a great disparity, in my opinion. I think that a lot of those communities, people are struggling, and I think they're not people who live in the metro area, earn six figures, and $1.75 doesn't mean a lot to them. Here, we pay 70 cents or something. It's no big deal, but out there in a lot of those communities, I think that's a hardship. I think it's a real problem, and especially if they look out at the disparity elsewhere. Why am I paying so much? I don't understand any of the stuff that has to be built and things that have to happen, and the cost of these types of things. And I really think that if were I someone living out there that was not earning a lot of money, it would be a major problem in my opinion. And wireless phone and cell phone is no longer a luxury. I mean, it's a necessity of life in a lot of places these days, and how people communicate. So, and the kids having one, and there's safety issues and stuff with that. It's no longer a luxury for mom and dad and the rest of the family to have a cell phone and need to communicate and have the ability to communicate with 911. I think it's something that's expected and should be. I don't know if it should be this. I don't know. I don't want to sound too socialist here, but I mean we've got it pretty made comparatively here to rural communities. And now there are mountain communities that can certainly afford that. But again, it's a disparate population, and a lot of the users of 911 are not people that necessarily have that extra $1.75 or $3 or $4 a month, however much it is, to contribute to that. It would help them if there was a leveling somehow.
And I do agree with Jeff that it is hard in the rural communities to gather as much revenues as the Front Range does. I also think it might come down to the way costs are managed. Some might be more efficient than the others, authorities as well, but I do think it is a problem.
I think there's always been a challenge for the rural areas. On the cost side, I think the statewide averaging for the ESP tariff services has been real important and will continue to be real important to maintain going forward, but of course that's only a portion of the cost side of it. I think in rural areas, they struggle with efficiencies of scale, and also so on the cost side, then they struggle with the revenue side because they don't have as many users. I think the pressure is higher in those rural areas where they have less revenue to contain the expenditures to the more traditional emergency telephone service costs, the ESP service, the costs that are closer to the end of receiving the call by the call taker than out at the extreme of implementing the call on the ground by the emergency responder. like most in most rural areas, the vast majority, if not all, the dollars are spent very close to the call taker. And that's different than in the metro area. The bigger metro area authorities struggle with not enough money, but they're using money farther and farther away, I think, from the call takers. So it's a different level of concern there. Consolidation, I think, is helpful in some context to assist in rural areas, but that doesn't translate into always direct savings, because the facility costs in serving a wider area, more dispersed area is not the same as trying to consolidate a couple of metro area PSAPs. But I do think that's regional, rural PSAP consolidations are things that are going to have to be looked at in the future. And if there isn't a way to provide statewide averaging on the revenue side, with the political support of the densely populated Front Range areas, that could help immensely. But so far, that's kind of been the elephant in the room that no one has really wanted to tackle. So we'll see how that goes.
And I'd just like to add, from the perspective of maybe a little bit of experience in having to oversee other programs in the telecommunications sector that have these same kinds of problems with contributions and things. Talking about money and who has control of the money is one of the toughest political things to begin with, and trying to figure out how to do it differently. But I'll tell you, when you want to start overlaying something like affordability and deciding, what someone's income is, or a particular area of the state should be able to afford more than it gets so bureaucratic, it's almost an impossible task. And I think while there might have been a time way back where it was just wireline service and it was more local, 911 was more specific to the fact that you live there. And so, maybe if you chose to live in a remote place, it should be a little pricier. The reality, and I think Jeff mentioned it, with technology today, the wireless technology, and everybody wanting to make sure they have access to everything, regardless of where they are, through their iPads, through their phones, through everything, kind of now blurs that distinction as to whether you're really an urban dweller or someone who lives in a rural area. We all expect 911 to be everywhere. So I think everybody gets that conceptually. And I think that the challenge is going to be to find ways to redefine the contributions base to cover everybody who really is and how they're using 911 services, regardless of where they're at, to see if we can find ways to meaningfully expand these or continue the statewide averaging, to see if we can find ways to possibly tap other funding, even for capital deployment, so that what's left for maybe rural areas is simply the cost of their operations and not some of these key capital expenditures. I think, or consolidations, we're just going to have to kind of get rid of our old norms and think a little differently as to how we want this to work for everybody, because if it doesn't work for everybody, it's going to be costly to even individual locations.
I believe back before I got involved, I've only been representing Brentsa since '98, but back in the old days, I understand that we had 911 service, we had to pay Quest or US West for that service, and we didn't have CAD systems. We had cards, note cards. And as we've had new technology come along to hopefully make us more efficient, we've had to pay for more of these things, and we've been paying for them with the surcharge. For an idea of the range, I believe when the foundation's been raising, getting contributions of funds for the advertising, we asked for about 3 cents per resident for a 3-month advertising buy. And I think the smallest county, it's like $25. The 3 largest are over 10,000. That's a pretty big range. At the same time, Brentsa's revenues from the surcharge are in the $3 million to $3.5 million range, but our total operating expenses, just for the 3 PSAPs, not including University of Colorado, are over $11 million. You know, we have higher expenses, I think, because we have more officers that we're managing. We have more incidents. We have more complex road networks. You know, there are also costs that come with a large area. So I don't, as an attorney, have a feel for the disparity in how much, you know, the lesser amounts that some rural areas might be getting. So I don't know how that compares to your full costs of 911 service. You know, some of the other things that might be changing, it's a fact that the cost of telecommunication services are related to the density. If you have to build 1 mile of fiber or 1 mile of a telephone line to serve 500 people or 300 people, and in a rural area I'm building a mile of telephone line to serve 1 ranch, you have to divide that cost by the number of people you're serving, and it makes a big difference in the costs. Now, when it comes to fiber, where they're selling it by bandwidth, they're pricing it by bandwidth, and they're not pricing it by distance. I think the cost of constructions are the same, but since the pricing methodologies all of the providers use, price it by bandwidth rather than distance. And so if you're not taking that distance into account, and in the rural areas you're using less bandwidth because you get a lower total number of calls, that may also help. You know, we've talked about funding, and I can tell you Brentsa does not support having a standardized fee statewide, because then you'll have a statewide agency take control of it. It'll go out of our hands. Brentsa does not object to subsidies for the rural areas. The position that the board has taken in the most recent times we've discussed it is that the concern is that if our voters, our constituents, are paying, you know, say 75 cents on their phone bill, and 25 cents of that is going through a subsidy to other areas, our constituents don't know that. They think they're still paying us a lot of money. And so if there's if additional subsidies beyond rate averaging are going to rural areas, we'd like to see that as a separate line item on telephone bills so that people know where that's going. And, you know, we don't think that people will object to, you know, having statewide 911, but don't leave confusion as to where the money they're paying is going. Related to that, at the conference I was at earlier today, there was discussion about how 80 years before we decide to have support health insurance and health care for everyone, we made a compact that there should be universal telephone service. And today, it's over 16% of what we pay in our telephone bill is a charge that goes to support universal service on the federal level. And I think maybe in some of our filings at the federal level, we need to start looking at that and saying, you know, the most important part of telephone service is the ability to reach help when you need it. That's something the Commission keeps saying in all of its rulemakings on 911. Maybe we can get some help there as well, in terms of high-cost type funds, universal service funds, for support of rollout of next-gen 911. And for 911 service in more rural areas where the cost tends to be more expensive. I think I'll leave. I think you'll have other questions. We'll get into some of the other points along there.
Okay. And I think you've got a question or comment. I'm going to give John a chance to respond. No. John?
No, I don't think I have anything else to add. I agree with those comments.
Okay. Jackie?
I just want to comment on the fact that while 911 surcharge has been used for various different things depending on what you can use it for and what you have the ability and the broadening of the legislation, there's also been a trend in the metro area where the 911 surcharges we had a trend throughout the state. I've been doing surcharges for several counties for years now, and we had a trend at first when we got wireless and everybody had a wireless and everybody had a landline. We had a trend where everybody was going up in surcharge. Well, and then we saw that trend happen where everybody said, I'm not paying for a landline and I'm paying for a cell phone, and they started dropping off with their cell phones. The things I'm seeing based on just the differences between the mountain area and the metro area is the mountain area surcharges are lessening by 1 to 3% each year, whereas the mountains are either increasing or staying static. And so there's some also disparity in what that is happening with those surcharges. Part of that has to do with people dropping landlines and cell phones with the packaging of cell phones. Summit County gets my daughter who lives in Brooklyn surcharge. So there's some things that are happening with cell phone surcharges that are going to affect more rural areas who are impacted. You know, I know in Summit County, and years ago, we could have up to 200,000 people in that county of 25,000 at that time. And so I'm sure that, you know, Eagle and Pitkin and all those other counties that have kind of that tourism population see that. So they don't get that 200,000. So I do think that in the future, going forward, we do need to really consider what we want to do and how we want to fund it. And the only other thought I had was, it's been mentioned a couple times, it's been thrown around, I think Dennis Tharp first came up with it, but an additional separate surcharge to go to a statewide fund, not to a statewide agency, but to a statewide fund to help fund infrastructure needed for next generation 911. Thank you.
You know, I think initially we saw an increase in lines because back in the 80s and 90s, everybody was getting fax lines and then dial-up internet lines, and that's now gone away. Then we saw the surge in cell phones. I think in the mountain areas, the problem we have is a lot of the resorts, they may have 500 hotel rooms, but they may have 5 lines going to the local switch, and the other lines come into Denver or to Canada and bypass the local network. And so they're not paying any surcharge on those. I think some of the people who have it worst are the people who have small rural counties that straddle I-25 or I-70. I think Clear Creek County said they get over 80% of their calls from I-70, and more calls than they have people in the county.
Got a couple questions back here. Liz?
And I just wanted to make one comment, is how our surcharge won't be keeping up, because now you're starting to see Wi-Fi calling, and those Wi-Fi enabled devices aren't paying a surcharge because they're not a cellular telephone, and I think that's going to blossom quickly.
So just one comment that occurred to me as Joe was speaking. I mentioned again and Joe mentioned that there's many programs that were, and when you look at your phone bill, there's a lot of surcharges on there. One of the biggest ones being the Federal Universal Service Fund at 16 or 17%, whatever it's at this quarter. The FCC, in conjunction with the Federal State Joint Board, has opened up a proceeding to look at the contributions base, and study that and come up with recommendations on what might need to change. And this is related to the Universal Service Fund. But I think that proceeding, and it would behoove all of us to really pay attention to what's coming out of that proceeding and some of the data they're gathering and what they're studying, because I truly believe that many of the same issues exist over there that exists for 911. And so, certainly as the commission, we should be helping you track that and bring some of that to the table. But that is just a recent thing going on, and I think it could really be insightful to what we're addressing here on 911.
Earlier, the question was asked, is the PUC seeing an increase in authorities asking for higher surcharge than the 70 cents? So I wanted to hear the answer to that question first.
We have not seen that much of an increase. We've had 5 applications this year, 3 from rural areas, 1 from a mid-size, which was Bretza, and then recently the city of Irvin.
So a follow-up to that question is, on those, what are they asking the increases for? Is it personnel? Is it, what are they asking for?
It is a mix between all the authorities. I'm going to say the majority was personnel. Some was equipment replacement for next-gen CAD replacements and stuff. So it's a mix of them.
Susan, do you know how many are above 70% or 70 cents? No. No?
I can't give you an exact number. I do have that listed on the Resource Center website. I do remember that the average right now is 86 cents.
I meant to look that up because one of the things in preparing for today, I did go back and looked at some old records. As of 1999, there was only 1 county that was above 70 cents. Grand County. Thanks, Todd. Paved the way.
So I do have a question for you, Lynn. In a couple of different meetings, you've mentioned specifically the high cost fund. And so my question is, as a commissioner, how could we consider using the high cost fund and creating some sort of grant program for PSAPs to apply to use those funds to get them installed with NG91 equipment? Is there a possibility to tap into that funding at all for the PSAPs?
Okay, so I sure wouldn't quote me on this, and I'll ask Susan to keep me a little bit honest here. I believe that, is it in section 208 or 502 that it mentions, or is it just in our rules that it mentions the need for universal service for the purpose of public safety? Do you recall? So there's not specific language in statute relating to a high cost fund. So I think, Kimberly, we would have to go back to our legal folks and see if there is a clear path through the statutes, and in particular with the high cost fund and the way it's now prescribed, given the telecom reform legislation, that has some limiting factors in there now as far as a contributions base and what we can do and move it over to and what it can cover, and see if there is an opportunity there. Are we truly looking at having to statutorily change something? And if we have to statutorily change something, I think one of the concepts that did come up during the telecom reform session but didn't really survive was to take a look at the money, as Joe was mentioning, that is getting transferred over for broadband purposes. Shouldn't right now those broadband grants can only go to, as we understand it, at least again preliminarily, to telecom providers. Well, should the public safety entities be able to apply for grants out of that broadband fund as well to deploy broadband on the public safety side? So I think we're going to have to look at it as we figure out kind of what the costs really are out there, and see, do any of the statutes really legitimately allow that, and we can tee it up to the commission with a straight face and let them make that decision, or would it really be better and need a statutory change?
I think we might look at the BESP as a provider, and can they apply for the funds, which if they're then not charging as much, then we could use other surcharge funds for other purposes. I don't think there's enough money in that fund. In past years, when the legislation, I testified that if they're going to create a broadband fund, the highest and best use of that would be to support Next Gen 911 and to support 911 service. This year I wound up abandoning that because there are a lot of people in the legislature and the governor's office who are expecting there to be significant funds going to broadband, and there's not enough money there to fight over.
John, do you have anything to add?
No, don't think so.
We've already touched on this to some extent. Right now, any increase over 70 cents has to be approved by the PUC. And as I said, the average statewide, the average 911 surcharge, if you just look at it strictly by number of counties, is 86 cents. Should that 70 cents be increased? And what to, if it is?
I think the easiest thing, which wouldn't require us to go back to the legislature, would be if Lynn and the folks at the commission would decide that they can apply a cost of living adjustment to that, which would bring it, I think when we filed our application was like $1.50, which we were so far under that you should even have to look at the application. I think the application process should also be revised so that if you're under the adjusted one, it's a very cursory review, and the commission's review should just be, are the things we want to spend it on things that are permitted under the statute. And, I felt at times like the staff was second guessing public safety professionals on what were prudent public safety 911 expenses, which I didn't think the PUC staff has the experience or knowledge to do. And so I'd like it to be a much simpler, faster process, go, no go if it fits into the categories, and accept our determination of what are the appropriate expenses within those categories.
So I think there's two parts here that I'll speak to, and I believe I've shared this with the task force as well. I don't know at this point whether there is an easy, clear path through our existing rules and our statutory authority for the commission to just up and declare across the board a cost of living type index increase automatically to that 70-cent threshold that's in the statute. So certainly that's something the commission would have to legally consider, and then if there was flexibility there, they'd have to decide from a policy standpoint, is that really a prudent thing to do, and just on their own versus going back through the legislature who says so. Hang on just a second, because I just got to answer to the second part of it, which is staff, when they get an application for a surcharge increase, we don't try, and we try and look at it as clear as we can within the context of what the statutes say are allowed or not allowed. And everybody knows that the statutes don't give you all the detail you need to make those decisions. Yeah. And we do engage an attorney an AG attorney on our side. So there certainly isn't any intent to necessarily second guess a particular 911 authority or not, but it's a really fine balancing line, because we are the steward and making the recommendations to the commissioners to make sure that we have done what we've been asked to do statutorily, that we just kind of have to run this fine line, because as Daryl and others well know, even the federal government is questioning the states right now on, are they using the surcharges for things other than your surcharges are being allowed to use for, and the state actually has to certify that to the federal government right now every year. So, we are always looked at too, and have to keep in the back of our mind that we may be audited on what we do. And so it does seem, it shouldn't be a rubber stamp process to those of you who are making the applications. It probably seems like you have to go through more than you should have to go through, and we are always open to ideas on how to streamline it, but we do at some point have to draw a line on we're not just going to streamline without doing our due diligence. So I guess I'll leave it at that.
The initial part of that question is, should we go back to the legislature and ask for an increase? I believe absolutely not. I think, that is just too risky. Anytime you go to the legislature, you don't know what you're going to get. And unless we know we've got very strong support, very focused support, a very narrow bill, and the telecom providers agree to stay out of it, which will not happen, I don't think you go into the legislature and ask for anything unless it's absolutely necessary and the only alternative. I have found the alternative of going to the PUC for an increase not to be very burdensome. It does require that you prepare a substantiated application, substantiate your costs. Cost of living increases, I think, take you a long ways. I think the closer you identify costs to the call taker, through the receipt of the call, the easier it is for the PUC staff to say it fits within the statutes, the state statutes, it fits within the federal requirements. The farther out you go, the more that becomes debatable and a concern. And for most 911 authorities, you've got plenty of costs that need to be funded close to the call taker. And you're really talking about, questions of shifting funds. And my advice is shift your need as close to the call taker and justify your application that way. And where I've had clients do that, I have found it to be a pretty easy process, not terribly difficult. Takes 6 or 7 months with some months of preparation beforehand. But if you're looking out, as you should be in your budgeting process, a long-term capital improvement plan of several years, you should know in advance that you're already in need, and you should get ahead of it. I haven't found it a big concerning problem.
Thank you, Bob. And also, I do think the surcharge should be relooked at legislatively. It hasn't been changed in, I think, approximately 30 years, and I think it should be revisited.
And I think Bob's comments are right on. I think, we certainly have done that since I've come on board with our authority is have that 5-year projection out there and monitoring the pulse of where we're at with our revenue every year and looking out and anticipating what our needs are going to be, especially with our consolidation regionalization process. Now I'm running 2 budgets, looking one at status quo operations projecting out 5 years and one at regionalization projecting out 5 years. And finally this year we decided that we did need to do an increase. We have given notice as of February we're going to 70 cents. But it's been a long time. We've been looking at that number for several years, and now that we have this plan ahead of us, we find that we do need to do that at this point in time.
There is one change I think that needs to be done that might streamline for the authorities, and that is after a surcharge has been approved, the authorities are required by statute to notify the telecom providers by registered mail, and this could be very costly and cumbersome for the authorities. And I think it's about time with all the modern technologies, the telecom providers can be notified via another method.
And I'll just mention one landline we stepped on with that is we sent out a whole bunch of them and at great cost. It's about $6 a piece for those, and a bunch of them came back because a lot of the tax, the folks that do the returns for them will not accept certified mail, will not sign for it. So we just learned that the hard way, and we've got to regroup and get notices out again. So.
And Joe, I know you had some additional comments. John, did you have anything?
Well, I guess I would say, as representing an authority board that's never been before the PUC for an increase, that I think they do due diligence. They do it in a timely fashion. I mean, I'd like to compliment them, having never been before them, to do that. But I think that it kind of begs the question, does the surcharge maximum need to be be increased? Yeah, I think it does, but I think that really is all in conjunction with an evaluation of what we're going to do about the revenue averaging thing. I mean, how do we do that? Is that part of a potential legislative change to modify the 70 cents? I think it all rolls in together, but if you look at cost of living and general costs of what we're doing, yeah, I suppose the answer to that is yes. What's incorporated in it is probably a bigger question. That's what we've been talking about all along, is how you do that statewide coverage without a statewide system.
If I can, I agree with Bob that we don't want to go to the legislature at this point. Every few years we've had some vendor start attending task force meetings and stand up and say, hey, I got a great idea. You probably never thought of this, but we should have one rate that we pay to the state that'll make it so much easier. When in fact it makes no difference because they have their tax partners that are paying local taxes in every jurisdiction anyway, but they always want to do that. And you can bet when we go into the legislature, they're going to pop up and want to have a flat rate statewide and make changes. My preference when we do have to go back for legislation would be to go back with a package that's around moving to next gen 911 with a lot of interdependent pieces so they can't start taking pieces apart without screwing up the whole package. I think that's the best way to try and get it through without changes. I think my first comment to Lynn would be that, there's one thing that you say, do or do I not have the authority as an agency to do this? The other thing is that you can do it, and if the legislature doesn't like it, they can always come back and change the law or let you know, that you take the action and let them stop you. And I think sometimes we need to be bold for the public interest. The other thing I would say is certainly when, you're talking about a firm range authority, we don't often go in for increases, but, if it's Bob, if it's me, if it's John, we're used to putting together their applications and showing and making demonstrations. A lot of the smaller jurisdictions appear to go without benefit of counsel with counsel who aren't familiar with this sort of thing, and that's where I think it would help if it was streamlined, or that there was a document produced by the PUC about what they look for, what the review process is, that would help people to kind of review and say, do I meet these showings, maybe even come up for a template. But also, my memory's failing me, I guess, in my advancing age, but it seems when I was looking through some of the applications that have been filed, there was one where there was some questioning about something like how many PSAP personnel were required, or something like that the commission was questioning, which it seemed to me that's a judgment being made by public safety professionals. You ought to give that deference. And so I may be slandering you. That may not be what it was about, but it was an area where I thought, this is a public safety professional making a judgment that should be entitled to deference from someone who's not a public safety professional. No, I read the application. And so I think, it would be helpful if we, did have, maybe a template and, a document so that the people are filing see what the review will look like, and it would help them in filing and getting through more smoothly without a lot of delay and difficulty.
Not a problem, and certainly those kinds of suggestions, and to the extent you want to spend some time helping us put one together, I'll engage you here, Joe, but we do kind of have a checklist. We point the 911 authorities to other ones that we felt like have been pretty good templates for applications, and we also offer and encourage people to provide us the drafts ahead of time. We go out and meet with the 911 authorities, oftentimes at their locations, to walk through it, if that would be helpful too. And if there is additional detail, say in the form of a template that could be more descriptive, I'm certainly open to putting something in place and posting it on the Resource Center website and on our website.
And then I've got more of a statement than anything, but I think, because I'm trying to gather the information to raise our 911 surcharge. At the same time, I've applied for a DOLA grant, and I think there's a big disconnect between the two state agencies, because DOLA's response is raise the 911 surcharge, and this is more from their employees, it's a simple process to raise the 911 surcharge, but also we don't want to, issue those grants if you're paying for employees out of those grants. So I think there's a disconnect between DOLA and the PUC that needs to be fixed, especially if people are either applying for grants.
I don't know if this would apply to your situation, but I had a client that was in that position. And what we did was we redirected the need that we were asking the PUC to address, again, back toward the call taker. And we redirected the need that we were asking DOLA through the grant process to take care of farther out toward the emergency responder and the general radio network.
Correct, and part of it, but I think it's not so much a disconnect with the grant board, but the grant staff, or the DOLA staff.
So this is unknown to me. Again, I'm familiar with the one situation in which one of the 911 authorities did reach out to DOLA for part of it, and it was all part of a conversation where we said, yeah, start looking and seeing if there's other grant things. So we were able to work that. So to the extent you come across these, always feel free to call us and get us on a call at the same time as the DOLA folks. We do operate pretty independently and don't always know what they're up to, or we're up to, or how we can work it together. But certainly I think there would be an expectation on our governor's part that we work well together. So get us engaged together and we'll deal with it.
Yeah, because I think their staff believes it's an easier process than it is, and it's a quicker process for the 911.
And I'm certainly not familiar with their grant processes necessarily, so right. I don't know that we're easier or harder, truly.
Thank you.
John, do you have anything to add?
Nope. Okay. Ken Dollar, just real quick, I don't want to just bellyache, we did work with the commission staff. They were easy to work with. We did a pre-filing and a review, and you can always contact them for help. I just think it would be easier for people who aren't represented by council or dealing in this kind of stuff more regularly if you're going to be doing it by yourself, if there was more of a guide and you knew what kind of things the staff was going to look at.
And working from two different 911 authority boards right now that are looking at possible increases due to, and you said earlier, you asked what the increases were for. These would be both for equipment, and they're both very close to the call taker themselves. It's just economics. And the other one is, like Jeff referred to, we have looked 5 years out, and to sustain what we're doing now. But it all fits with everything that you guys have said. To what point are we going to be able not to do that without consolidation and because the equipment just keeps getting more expensive all the time. And Lynn and Susan have been great. When we call them, they give us the information we need. And I think the education is, I've got two of my authority board members from WY with me here right now today, and the others couldn't make it from Logan County, but I think education of those. They don't have a real clear, crisp idea of what is expected, and even when you tell them, they have to go to the next level up to the commissioners, and most of the time they have no idea what's going on. So thank you for your help, and that's it.
Thank you. We're actually at time, but this has been a great discussion, so I don't want to cut it short. Does anybody have anything else? If not, I've got one more question that I want to make sure that we don't miss. Okay. And I don't see Kimberly here. I think she might have stepped out, but she had to leave. Kimberly was really the driving force behind us getting a prepaid legislation in Colorado. But at the time, I did some back-of-the-envelope estimates of what we might be able to expect to collect. and it was based on the average number of minutes that people, or the average amount of money that people spend on minutes every month if they're using prepaid, and how many, the percentage nationally of how many people who use wireless were using prepaid. And it came out to about $7.5 million a year. We've never even come close to that. And I just checked with DOR, and last fiscal year we collected $2.2 million. So I guess my question is the prepaid surcharge working? Is there something that we need to do different? Is there some way that we can look into trying to determine whether it is under collecting and how to fix that?
It is under collecting. You can't get all of the internet vendors to remit charges, and you can't enforce it. As far as the small retail outlets, brick and mortar outlets, they're not doing it. The DOR isn't making a priority for enforcement. If they're going out and investigating remittance of general sales taxes, they'll ask questions about that as well. Dennis and I met with the woman in charge of this program at the DOR, it must be 2 years ago, and they're allowed to keep more money from the surcharge, and we said to them, and thought we had an agreement, that they would keep a little additional money, they would hire some staff that they had just laid off, they would hire them back, just to start with the largest vendors and work their way down until the returns diminished to the point that it didn't make continued sense, and do enforcement, and that never happened. They never followed through. The position Bretza has taken in pleadings with the FCC is that the only way we're ever going to collect from prepaid is if a nationwide surcharge when prepaid is put in, where the vendors include it in their cost of minutes as a line item, and then they remit when the minutes are activated. I think we're also losing money to VoIP providers. We don't even know what VoIP providers are operating in our jurisdictions. I think in the larger scale, and we've also talked about this with the Commission, is that we need to move to a model where we're charging on connections. And that even becomes more important where we have over-the-top text messages being sent, as in addition to SMS text messages. The FCC's now push to require the applications that ride over internet connections or data connections on your phone that aren't the SMS to send text messages, that they'll be required to. If we go by the vendors, the communication service, the text message, the phone application, we're never going to collect from all of them. But there always has to be some kind of a physical architecture in the state, outside of satellite services, which are a small percentage, such as a broadband connection, DSL connection to telephone line, connection from wireless tower to your phone. And so we should be charging on those connections per unit of upstream bandwidth, which relate to how many lines you have of outgoing calling, and stop trying to charge on each individual voice application provider or text message provider or whoever else we might. And at least then we would get to a place where we don't have a lot of free riders, and we have kind of a stable environment where everybody's being treated equally, and we don't have a lot of, people are just slipping through the cracks, or just, we're not going to pay.
So just a couple of thoughts, because I know...
Hold on one second. John?
Yeah, I agree with Joe. I think the problem, and I think we kind of anticipated it with DOR, is that you turn that over to them, you're turning enforcement over to them, and I think the enforcement hasn't been what it could have been, and I think that that reflects your back of the envelope calculation as opposed to what we've actually collected. I think that's what Joe says is absolutely accurate. I agree.
Thank you, John.
So just a couple of thoughts, and I was involved in the process when the legislation was set up, and also with DOR, and I believe they roughly collect 4% for administration of that, which is, really, considering funds, that's a fairly healthy amount of money. And from the get-go, we're very adamant that they would only look at enforcement and only have personnel to do enforcement when they were out there with the company for another purpose on another issue, then they ask them about all of their tax issues and go across the board and make sure they're doing everything correctly. So we haven't had a lot of success there, but I don't know how off we are in the revenue, and certainly we all feel like there's a lot more prepaid VoIP companies, et cetera, out there. I think we need to look at a couple of things here. One, I think through the telecom reform legislation and our rules that will be coming out for 911, we are going to have to look at a process in conjunction with basic emergency service where carriers kind of self-identify themselves and register with the commission. And one of the main reasons for that is not even just 911, but because a lot of those companies are now deregulated in all other aspects, we still have reasons to need to know that they're out there and exist. So that might help us see who the basic companies are that are really out there. Maybe that'll give us some baseline to start comparing with who DOR collects from. One of the other DOR issues is everything is the data is very confidential over there, so you have trouble getting a hold of the data, so that poses some challenges with us. The other thing I think it would behoove us to do is this model for how prepaid is charged is pretty well a nationwide model. And it might be worth outreach to some of the other states to see if they're encountering the same kind of issue. Do they feel like they're really collecting all the revenues out there, or do other states have other ways of addressing this through this kind of charge on prepaid that we might know? Are we all facing the same issue, or is it unique to Colorado? I don't know that having a national surcharge on prepaid is necessarily a bad idea. I think it's a pretty tough and impossible task. I think there would be a lot of resistance towards having the feds just levy a surcharge against everybody that the states have to live with. You start getting into the whole state preemption thing again, and that's just a tough hurdle at the national level.
And since I've got a couple of my NASNA friends here, my NASNA colleagues here, I'll tell you that at those meetings, prepaid is a big topic, and I believe pretty much every state that has point of sale prepaid is experiencing the same underwhelming collection that we are. Maybe we should get Joe Barrows from Kentucky here next year. We'll take up a whole hour.
I agree with Joe's analysis. I don't know that those are exactly the right answers. I don't know any better ones, but certainly Joe's got a great handle on the problems, and I think there is underreporting. One of my hopes is that with all current technology, that this is going to be a real transient piece of technology, and we'll move to something that's easier to deal with. So that's always a hope. I don't know if it's realistic in this case or not. But the other side of this then goes back to if we use a different model, or if we change the model at all, then how do we distribute the revenues? And I think especially with any kind of wireless technology, any kind of internet-based technology, we need to rely less and less on a fixed location for distribution of revenue. You all have cell phones, and you all know how many different jurisdictions you're in any one given day, and I think that's real typical. And that is one of the problems that, makes it really difficult for the rural communities, the communities along I-70, Gilpin County. They have a situation similar to the ski area towns. They have very low population, but they have a huge number of people in their communities at any given time whose cell phones are all registered elsewhere, and they receive a ton of calls. Cripple Creek probably has the same problem. So anyway, I think that revenue distribution side is going to have to be reconsidered as we look at different models for these technologies.
And I have no comment.
And that's the problem, is that you have, these communities that have not only, the tourist influx, but seasonal variances. During that entire year, they have to maintain a communication center, a PSAP, at certain staffing levels and with certain levels of equipment and capability, regardless of what the loading is on their system, although it has to be equipped for that somewhere up there, not at the maximum, but somewhere near between median and maximum loading at all times. And so
that's the problem. Is so you don't have enough revenue because you have so few residents. And you have this loading that occurs. So our revenue stream should be based on loading also. As wireless towers are loaded, there should be some way of having a magic box that certainly the NSA probably has out there, but that would somehow give us a gauge on that, like a water meter, and tell us what these telephone service providers should be remitting for 911 services. And that takes prepaid out of the equation because it just measures the loading, that whether it's a prepaid phone or a smartphone or whatever it is, what loading it presents, and whether you're a transient person driving through the state or someone traveling from Denver to Cripple Creek to recreate, your loading on any given system is monitored, and your revenue is based upon that. I don't know how we get to that, but I think that's what's needed somehow.
John, do you have anything to add?
No.
Joe, final comment.
Final comment, just TracFone has been in front of the FCC and in ex-party meetings with commissioners urging the FCC to get away with it and forbid the states from doing point of sale and to start moving towards funding 911 out of general funds. They've now filed a petition with the Wireless Bureau asking the Wireless Bureau to declare that point of sale collection of fees on the Lifeline phones is unconstitutional. Jeffco, Adams, Arapahoe, and Boulder are working on a response to that in opposition to that. I think when you look at the complexity and the cost, if all the states and all the cities and all the counties had to move from existing funding mechanisms towards the general fund, which is what TracFone is pushing generally, I think it's much less of a leap to trying to get to a nationwide prepaid where they would just have to remit the charges when the minutes are activated and we wouldn't lose anybody. But I certainly think we need to be cautious of these people who are proposing to go to general fund. It would cause us unique problems at present table.
Thank you very much. We are over, and I don't want to take any more time from our last panel today, so let's just take a 5-minute break and then come back in for our last panel. Thank you. Yes. Applaud, applaud.